Long exposures can produce very dramatic images for a variety of reasons. One of my favorite reasons is that it produces very rich, deep colors in situations that you do not expect them, very low lighting conditions. And also because it gives us an opportunity to capture motion, for example, moving lights. Here I have some cars going by in front of an opera house. The cars will have their lights on, of course, and I'm able to see the blur of those lights in a long exposure. So instead of seeing individual cars, I'll just see streaks of taillights and headlights. And of course, I have the building here dramatically lit. Of course, in addition to being very dramatic and very appealing in terms of the final image, long exposures produce some serious challenges for us in terms of the actual exposure. To start with, we have very bright lights, street lights, lights illuminating the building, the headlights of cars, and we also have very dark areas. For example, here I have a park across the street that's not illuminated at all. That creates a very high dynamic range and a big opportunity to fool the camera's meter. And in fact, very often when you're metering a long exposure, you really can't trust the meter at all. Sometimes, in fact, the meter will simply not be able to give you a reliable reading at all. You'll need to experiment. Now, if you do include the sky in your exposure and you want to create an exposure based on the ambient light, you can meter off of the sky and then reduce the exposure by about 1 stop. That will include some dark detail in the sky, but also ensure that you're able to achieve a long exposure. We're going to use the bulb mode for long exposure, so I'll set my camera to bulb mode and adjust my aperture as desired. You can, of course, use just about any exposure mode to capture a long exposure, but I generally prefer to use the bulb exposure mode because it gives me a little bit more flexibility. I'm able to fly by the seat of my pants experimenting with different shutter speeds. Now, I also will make sure to use a cable release. This is necessary if I'm capturing at more than 30 seconds, but also helpful to ensure that I'm not imparting any vibration to the camera, and it just makes it a little bit easier to work. So we'll go ahead and get the camera set up here. In this case, I'm capturing at an aperture of f/16 to give me some good depth of field. I've got a lot of subjects to contend with, a building and some cars in the foreground, some other cars off in the background in the park. So be sure to think about that. And in particular, you're probably going to be narrowing down that aperture quite a bit, stopping down quite a bit so that you can get a longer shutter speed. And then I'll go ahead and make my exposure. So we'll go for about 15 seconds here using my cable release so that I don't, again, get that vibration in the camera. Now, one of the things to keep in mind when you're using a long exposure like this is that there's going to be heat buildup in the camera, and so noise becomes a particular problem. For that reason, you'll want to make sure that you turn on the long exposure noise reduction feature if your camera offers that. Once the capture has been achieved, we'll go ahead and take a look here. Yeah, we've got an image that is properly exposed in this case. I, of course, have done a little bit of testing to make sure that I was using an appropriate shutter speed for the conditions, and we get some nice streaks of light going through the scene. Now, it's going to take some practice and some testing, some experimentation to produce the very best results. There's tremendous variation from one scene to the next because of the very dramatic and extreme lighting conditions you're going to be dealing with in situations, dark lighting, where you're able to achieve an especially long exposure. So don't get frustrated if it takes a variety of different captures at different times to produce the very best results. Take the time to practice and test and experiment as best you can, and with time you'll get some very dramatic and wonderful images.